Okay, so this is going to be the first lecture where we're actually going to use multiple hosts or nodes or instances or whatever you want, multiple OSs. And we're going to set up a 3-node swarm across all 3 of those nodes. We unfortunately can't do this part with the built-in Docker on your machine because that's only going to provide us 1 OS. And we need 3 Linux OSs to play with this next set of features. So the first option you're going to have is using playwithdocker.com. It's absolutely the easiest way to get started. It comes with Docker pre-installed. It takes you seconds to provision 3 different machines, and it requires no investment on your end. But it does mean that every 4 hours, it will wipe all the work you've done. So if you think you're going to do the rest of this section over the course of days, then this may not be the best option for you. But if you're going to focus for a few hours, you can definitely get through most, if not all, of the multi-node swarm stuff using Play with Docker in one sitting. Another option you have is you can use Docker Machine, which is not something we've talked about yet, but it's a command line tool that actually gets installed with Docker for Windows and Docker for Mac, and you can download it for Linux. And it is basically an automation tool for provisioning virtual machines locally and on the internet, and then automatically setting up Docker for you. The default way that it works is with VirtualBox, which you can install free, but it does mean that if you're going to run 3 virtual machines locally, each one of them probably needs a gig of RAM or so to run through a lot of these examples, so you'll need a machine with a good amount of RAM in it. Another option, and the one that I'm going to default to for a lot of these demos and walkthroughs, is DigitalOcean. And I just recommend DigitalOcean just because they have the cheapest and easiest servers to get started, and they run everything on SSD, so it's nice and fast. And you can actually use this in a very, very similar setup to what production would be, because you're using 3 actual virtual machines in the cloud, and it takes about a minute to launch each virtual machine. So if you're thinking that that might be an option, you can use my referral code in the references to this section to get your first $10 free. If you're only going to take a few days to get through this swarm stuff, you can provision 3 $10 a month nodes and have them up for days or a week, and that might fit within the $10 budget, so it technically wouldn't cost you anything. And then lastly, there are so many ways to get Docker installed, and that's really all you need is 3 machines with Docker installed on them. You can use Docker Machine. It has built-in drivers that allow you to use it to provision Amazon instances or Azure instances or DigitalOcean droplets or Google Compute nodes. Or if any place you can get a Linux virtual machine, you can actually just install Docker with an automated script from git.docker.com. And frankly, I prefer the git.docker.com version only because Docker Machine may save you a few steps, especially for locations like Amazon and Azure that require you to provision a lot of different things before you can get to just provisioning a virtual machine. But you're probably not going to be using Docker Machine in production. It is a tool to simply automate dev and test environments. It was never really designed to set up all of the production settings you might need for a multi-node swarm. So there's nothing inherently wrong with it, but typically git.docker.com works on all the major Linux distributions and doesn't take any longer than actually using Docker Machine itself. So I'm going to give you a really quick example of just getting any of these scenarios to the point where Docker is installed. And then they're all will be very similar in the way we actually create the swarm and do our services. So don't think that you have to do it the way I do it. Really, we're just trying to get Docker info to actually bring back information, and then just to make sure that the 3 nodes have networking access to each other and they're on a well-connected network. So ideally, they should be in the same network. So if you were going to use Play with Docker, you actually just go to playwithdocker.com and check on the box for I am not a robot. And if it gives you the CAPTCHA screen, just follow along. All right, so you'll see that it's counting down my 4 hours, but if I just click the creating instance and then I click it 2 more times, it'll create 3 virtual environments very quickly. And as a side note, this is actually using Docker in Docker, which is a pretty neat technology where we're actually running Docker inside a Docker container. But in this setup with Play with Docker, which was created by other Docker captains and the Docker team, it's really hard to tell the difference. So if I go to node 1, you can already see that Docker info gives me the latest version. And if I even tried to ping node 2, it actually recognizes friendly names. So it'll make it easier to communicate back and forth between them. And so if this is something you want to try, it's a great and easy way on either low-powered machines or if you just don't want to take the time to set up an environment for the next 4 hours. So option 2 is to use Docker Machine. And if you have it installed, it should be at least version 10, if not newer. You'll know if it's installed because you'll type the Docker Machine command from your command line and it'll either work or it won't. If you need to download it for your particular Linux OS, then you can hop over to the Docker documentation, which will actually give you a quick curled line to download it. But if you're using the toolbox on Windows 7 and 8, or Docker for Windows on Windows 10, or Docker for Mac on Mac OS, it's already going to be up to date on those OSs for you. If you want to use the VirtualBox option, which is the default, you just need to jump over to virtualbox.org and download the latest version for your OS. And you don't even have to do anything with VirtualBox. It just needs to be installed. And then from your command line, you can just type Docker machine create node 1. And this will actually run through creating a virtual machine with BusyBox, which is a very lightweight Linux distribution. And this will actually run through creating a very lightweight Linux machine. And you'll just repeat those 2 commands for node 2 and 3. And if you need more information on Docker Machine, you can actually look at my reference section for tutorial links. Once your machines are created, you really have 2 options for how you can access those machines. You can either use Docker Machine SSH and then the name of the node you created, and that'll hop you right into that machine. Or you can use the environment command. So the command Docker Machine env and then the name of the machine you want will give you some output, and you can either cut and paste these options to your command line, or you can copy and paste the bottom option, and that will actually create the environment variable so that when I run my Docker command, because again, the Docker CLI just needs to know what Docker host to talk to, and by default, it's talking to your local machine, but that just reprogrammed it to talk to the Docker machine node 1. So if I do Docker info, you'll see that its name is node 1 because that's the one I'm actually now operating on. For the last example, I'm going to use DigitalOcean, which I've created an account on, and here they call servers droplets. And I recommend, if you don't have a specific reason to run another OS, to start with Ubuntu 16.04, because that tends to be the first Linux distribution to support the newer Docker features. And so that's the default there. And then I would recommend for the remainder of this course for us to use the $10 a month server. You might be able to get away with the $5 a month server, but it might get a little bit slow during some of the later demos when we do monitoring and logging containers on top of our applications. Then you can pick the data center closest to you. And then the only other option is to add an SSH key. If you're not familiar with how to create your own SSH key locally and then upload the public into DigitalOcean, there's a great tutorial that they have for it that you can find in the resources of this section. So down at the bottom, I'm going to create 3 machines, and I'm going to call them node 1, 2, and 3. And then I need to wait probably about 60 seconds, and they'll be ready for me. So you could just use the IP addresses here to jump on these machines, clicking the copy button, and then SSH root at the IP address. And if your SSH key is properly set up on your machine, then it'll automatically log in with that key. But in the resources section, I've given you an example of how to set up a .ssh config file that will allow you to have these 3 nodes in a config, so you can just simply call them node 1, node 2, node 3, instead of having to remember their IP addresses. In case you're going to be doing this over multiple days, that's really an easy way to get in and out of these servers. Okay, so if you've used Docker Machine, or if you use Play with Docker, then Docker's already installed, and you're getting ready to create your swarm. But if you use DigitalOcean, or you roll your own VMs, then you need to get Docker installed. And the easiest way to do that I like to use, is to use the script over at git.docker.com. And you can see examples up here of how to use this script to get the current production release of Docker on your machine. Okay, so now all 3 of my servers have the latest version of Docker installed, and we're ready to set up our swarm. So again, all that's required is that these 3 nodes have solid networking to each other and specific ports open. And if you're curious about the ports of Swarm, look in the resources of this section where I actually have a link to my own list of the firewall ports necessary for Swarm to work. If you remember before, we did Docker Swarm init. Now, in this case, which is pretty common in cloud servers, it wants us to specify an IP address to advertise the Swarm service on. You want to use an IP address that is accessible from the other servers. And in this case, I'm going to use the public IP address for my DigitalOcean host. And there we go. So far this is just like on our local machine. Now this time though, I'm going to copy the swarm join command and go over to node 2 and add it in. And there we go. This node is now a part of the swarm. So if we go back to node 1, Docker node ls, and now we have 2. And you'll notice the second node is only a worker, because as it says, if we wanted it to be a manager, we should have gotten this manager token. But no worries, we can actually update this worker to promote it to being a manager. But if we're over on node 2, notice that I can't use swarm commands because workers aren't really privileged. They don't have access to control the swarm. So they're not going to be able to use any of the swarm commands that we're used to using on the managers. So back on node 1 in the manager, I'm going to do a Docker node update. And what I was doing there was hitting tab for tab completion, which is always a fantastic feature in Docker, especially with so many features. And it was walking me through each step of how to use that update command. Now I've got this final update finished and it is changed node 2. So now if I do my Docker node ls, you'll see that now it's considered reachable, but the original node is still the leader. By the way, the little asterisk, that just means that's the node you're currently talking to. Now for node 3, let's add it as a manager by default. So we need to go back to our original command of Docker swarm, and then we need to get the join token manager. Now, you can get these tokens at any time. You don't have to write them down or save them. They're part of the swarm configuration and stored encrypted on disk. So don't worry about that. You can also change these in case they possibly get exposed, or you maybe get a server that might have had a vulnerability on it and you want to make sure that no nodes can join the swarm from the old key. You can actually rotate these keys. So I'm going to copy this, paste it into node 3. And there we go. Back on node 1, if I do a Docker node ls again, you'll see I've got 3 nodes, and they all have a manager status indicating that they are managers. Okay, so now we have a 3-node redundant swarm with 3 managers, and let's just do the same thing we did earlier. Docker service create Alpine ping 8888. Only this time, let's give it 3 replicas. And then do a Docker service ls. And we'll see we've got 3 of 3 already running. And if I did a Docker node ps, I can actually see my local node is actually running this task or container, and I can actually specify the node 2, and it'll give me just the containers running on node 2. If I wanted to get a full list, I could do a Docker service ps, and then Sleepy Brown is the name that it gave our service. And you'll see here, let me expand the screen a little bit. You can see here that it's listing all 3 of our tasks. Once you've got this swarm created, you normally don't need to be typing commands into all the different nodes. You can really operate the whole swarm for most things from node 1. So we'll be doing a lot of our work from node 1 in future lectures. But for now, pat yourself on the back because you have a fully operational swarm cluster.